Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the founder and chairman of the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, Pete Peterson.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm especially pleased to welcome such a remarkable group of distinguished leaders and influential voices. We meet at a very pivotal and hopeful moment. Last year, at the time of our fiscal summit, we were all still trying to convince Americans that our long-term fiscal problem is a problem of serious magnitude. Today, more and more Americans are opening their eyes, their ears, and their minds to the unprecedented fiscal dangers that lie ahead. They are looking for answers, for solutions, ergo, our Solutions Initiative. Let me briefly review the progress. The Bowles-Simpson Commission, led by two extraordinary public servants, one of whom is with us today, issued an urgent call for action and offered a comprehensive plan to put our country on a path to long-term fiscal sustainability. A clear majority of that commission, including both Republicans and Democrats, voted for its recommendations. House Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan, who is also on our program, recently presented a Republican framework for long-term deficit reduction. And President Obama, represented today by his chief economic advisor, Gene Sperling, has presented his framework as well. And of course, a bipartisan group of senators, including Saxby Chambliss, Kent Conrad, Mike Crapo, Dick Durbin, and Mark Warner, all of whom are here today, has been working toward a broad, long-term agreement. To advance the discussion further, we asked 6 leading think tanks across the ideological and generational spectrum to present their own solutions to America's budget challenges. Michael Peterson will tell you more about the 6 plans, but I would just like to express my deep appreciation to each organization for all the work they put into their plans. It seems to me we are confronting a debt burden that can result in a short-term and a long-term crisis. In the short term, our spiraling debt could lead to a devastating financial crisis. Because of our dismal savings rate and our huge deficits, which after all are negative savings, we are becoming ever more dependent, and in my view, dangerously so, on foreign capital. For example, in 1970, 5% of our public debt was in foreign hands. Today, it is about 50%, and it is projected to explode in the future. And let us not forget the international debt bubble. Virtually all of the developed countries have similar demographics, including lower birth rates with increasing longevity, particularly those 85 and older, I thank God for that, who consume far more health care than the younger elderly. Over the next quarter century, the debt burden of advanced economies is projected to approach 200% of their GDP. Clearly, this is unthinkable and unsustainable. Herb Stein, an economist in the administration that I work with in the White House, and our only humorist, used to say, if something's unsustainable, it tends to stop. And he added, if your horse is dead, I suggest you dismount. My friends, let's dismount. If we wait to act and allow investor confidence to erode, interest costs could rise dramatically and unexpectedly with terrible consequences for America's businesses, families, and the government. The resulting economic and political climate of quick and devastating changes will also put at risk our social safety net, which I believe simply must be protected for the vulnerable in our society. All in all, the risk of implosion of global financial markets is simply too great for mere talk and political posturing. In addition to the potential of a short-term crisis, we also need to consider the long term. If we continue to accumulate debt and pay ever higher interest costs, we will not be able to make the critically needed investments to keep our economy strong and competitive. And with the growing dominance of China and others, that is simply unacceptable. We simply must become more competitive and more committed to investment and innovation. That requires greater investment in R&D, education, particularly math and science, and our crumbling infrastructure. But we will not be able to make those investments if our federal interest costs skyrocket, as they are projected to do. The long-term consequences, if we do not achieve fiscal sustainability, are that we end up a much diminished America, economically, politically, and socially. Changing our course will require tough decisions by the American people. And to build support for these decisions, we must make clear what we gain tomorrow for what we give up today. I think back to a period in my life when I had a really serious weight problem. I was an eager eater, indulged by a Greek mother who was an excellent baker. By the time I was an adult, my eating habits had left me far too big for my britches, literally. And I tried dieting and failed every time because every diet dwelled on what I had to give up. I finally saw a psychiatrist who had a mirror in which you could dial up your ideal weight. And that would change the image reflected back to you. Suddenly, rather than focusing entirely on what I had to give up, I had a positive vision of what I had to gain: a leaner, sexier Pete Peterson. I recalled that decision daily. It gave me the motivation to stay on the right course. The American people need such a positive vision, not of a leaner, sexier Pete Peterson, but a vision of a nation with a competitive, healthy, growing economy. An economy that has the resources to invest in its future and at the same time can support programs like Social Security and Medicare that so many vulnerable Americans rely on. Finally, permit me a presumptuous minute or two to lay out two critical new areas on which our foundation plans to spend significant time in the coming years: healthcare costs and the defense budget. While we have long debates, as we should, about Medicare, we devote much less attention to the healthcare system as a whole, where the private costs account for about 50% of total spending. The sad truth is that many of these costs are very excessive and serve as one of the most anti-competitive forces in our economy. Consider this: we spend about twice as much per capita as the rest of the developed world, with health outcomes that are at least no better than our peers. We are racing towards health care spending of 20% of our GDP. That would be 7 to 10% more of our GDP than any other developed country spend. This represents 2 to 3 times our total investment in R&D, both public and private. This is incredibly short-sighted at a time when the competitive agenda cries out for far more investment in innovation. There is much we don't know about how to reduce healthcare costs, but too often we don't apply what we do know. Today, I'll give you just two examples. The first is our perverse fee-for-service payment system, which along with our medical liability system maximizes volume, not value. The result is that we conduct, for example, more than twice the number of CT scans as Australia and 3 times the number of MRIs as the UK. Unfortunately, we don't yet have an alternative payment system worked out. An example of how we're able to identify solutions but do little to implement them is the egregious and inexplicable variations in cost for medical treatment throughout the country. No business would ever tolerate such variations. A business would shine a light on the variations and figure out how to apply best practices elsewhere. We simply must determine how to incentivize individuals and institutions throughout the healthcare system to do the same. Medicare, because it has access to extraordinarily detailed data on cost, volume, and quality of care patients receive, is in a very good position to reward good performance and penalize bad performance. We feel so strongly about the need to improve value throughout the healthcare system that we are establishing a new Center for Healthcare Value within the Peterson Foundation. The center will support research into a broad range of ideas to maximize healthcare value. Our second area of new focus is defense. All of us would agree that we must do whatever is necessary to keep our country safe. But it is important to acknowledge that the U.S. currently spends as much on defense as the next 17 best spending nations combined. Even the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, said, and I quote, "The single greatest threat to our national security is our debt." He also said the Pentagon budget has doubled in the last decade, and in doubling, we have lost the ability to prioritize, to make hard decisions, to do tough analyses, to make trades. I believe it is past time to have a fundamental review of the defense budget conducted by some of America's leading, highly respected and informed citizens, a highly credible and bipartisan group. Among the many questions included in such a fundamental review, I believe these must be asked. First, what are the principal security threats facing our nation in the 21st century? I emphasize 21st century. And what strategies, both military and non-military, would best respond to these threats? Second, what new force structure, basing, and weapon systems would fit those new strategies? For example, we have more than 700 military installations and bases abroad in more than 50 countries. Are all these bases compatible with our security threats and our defense strategies? And third, to what extent should the U.S. military continue to engage in counterinsurgency wars and nation-building efforts around the world as we have in the past decade? Answering these questions and many more will help to keep America secure while releasing resources America desperately needs to rebuild its economic strength, which is, after all, the ultimate source of our military and diplomatic power. Finally, I have a little dream all my own. My little dream is that a year from now, at our next summit, we are not simply talking about solutions and what needs to be done, but what has actually been done. The time for action is now. Thank you very much.